All right, let's dive into something pretty fundamental. How we reason and argue, It's like acting as philosophers in the most basic way we can, I guess. Engaging with ideas, using the power of argumentation.
Yeah, I like that. And to really get into it, we're going deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their entry on argument and argumentation. It's amazing, really lays out how people have thought about this for centuries.
Right. And don't worry, when we say argumentation, we're not talking about, boring textbooks and stuff. It's more about how we try to persuade each other, like how we weigh different viewpoints, how we try to understand each other, maybe even the world a little bit better. Like you see it in debates all the time, or how we interpret the news, even just those little arguments you have with yourself in your head.
Absolutely. And what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is pull out the most important insights, like what arguments actually are, how they work, and why they're so important. We're hoping for those aha moments for you,
Yeah.
give you a better grasp of this thing that's such a big part of being human. And hopefully along the way, we'll uncover some stuff that might surprise you.
And it's really wild when you start thinking about it, how many different fields are involved in studying this. Obviously, philosophy, right?
Mhm.
But then you've got linguistics, looking at how we use language in arguments, law, focusing on arguments in court, cognitive science, trying to understand the mental processes, even computer science with AI and argumentation. It really shows you how wide reaching and important this whole topic is. So, first things first, when we talk about argument versus argumentation, what are we really talking about?
So basically, an argument has these two main parts, the premises and the conclusion. Premises are statements, and they're presented as support for the conclusion. That support relationship is really key. And it can be, different kinds of support. The premises might totally guarantee the truth of the conclusion, or they might just make it more likely, more convincing to you. You can think of an argument as a symbolic structure, or even as a way of using language, what we call a speech act.
A speech act. Now that sounds interesting. So, like, how is making an argument like actually doing something?
Think about it this way. When you make an argument, you're not just stating facts, right?
Yeah.
You're doing something with language. It's
Mm.
an act of premising.
Yeah.
You're asserting certain things to support a conclusion. And there's also the act of concluding. And often there's a signal, either directly or indirectly, like therefore or because, that shows you this connection.
So if I say it's snowing, therefore school will be canceled, that first part is my premise, the second part is my conclusion, and that therefore is the marker that links them up. Makes sense. Now, the source makes a distinction between argument and argumentation. What's the big difference there?
Okay, so for clarity, we usually think of argument as that underlying structure of premises and conclusion, like it's the thing itself, right? But argumentation, that's about what happens when people actually use these arguments to communicate. The human practices involved, putting forward reasons, exchanging reasons to back up claims or challenge others, especially when there's doubt or you disagree with something.
Gotcha. So argumentation is inherently social, like a back and forth between people, or even just in your own head when you're thinking things through.
Yeah, you got it. It's like a dialogue, even when you're reasoning by yourself, or when, like, a writer presents an argument to an audience that's not directly responding. But it's not just any kind of talking. Argumentation happens when there's a claim and someone asks for the reasons behind it, or if the person making the claim thinks they'll need to justify it, to you or to someone else. That's when we move into this mode of, give me your reasons.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, think about it. Every day we're just bombarded with information. And this idea of argumentation, asking questions, providing justification, that's a crucial skill to have these days. Helps you filter through it all.
It totally is. It's vital for, deciding what to believe, what claims you should accept. And it's connected to this whole idea of reasoning, that internal mental process we each use to reach conclusions. There's this debate about whether reasoning and argumentation are separate things, or just two sides of the same coin. Some think our ability to reason internally, like in our own heads, actually develops from participating in these public exchanges of reasons.
That's a trippy thought, isn't it? Like, what if our own thinking is a learned skill, something we pick up from interacting with others? Okay, so we've got the basics. Now let's look at the different kinds of arguments. The source talks about deduction, induction, abduction, and analogy. So, deduction first. What's the big deal with deduction?
Deduction is all about certainty. You want absolute certainty. If your premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. No way around it. It's about what we call necessary truth preservation. That classic example. All mammals are warm-blooded. A whale is a mammal. Therefore, a whale is warm-blooded. If those first two statements are true, then there's just no way the third one can be false. The conclusion is like already baked into the premises, right?
Yeah.
So the power of deduction is that it promises certainty. The trade-off is that the conclusion doesn't really add brand new information. It's more about making clear what's already implied, what's already there.
So it's a guarantee. And
Yeah.
that's where these ideas of validity and soundness come in, right? That
Right. A deductive argument is valid if the conclusion logically follows from the premises, even if those premises aren't actually true in the real world. It's about the structure of the argument itself. A sound argument, though, that's when it's valid and the premises are actually true. Then you got a guaranteed true conclusion.
Okay, so I think I'm following. Valid structure plus true starting points equals a sound argument, and you get a true conclusion. Now, the source mentions this thing called monotonicity. What does that tell us about deductive arguments?
Okay, so monotonicity means that if you've got a valid deductive argument, adding more premises won't suddenly make it invalid. It still works. For example, if A and B, therefore C is valid, then A and B and D, therefore C is also valid. You can't break a valid deduction by just piling on more information. That's a big difference from other types of arguments where adding more info could actually weaken the link between the premises and the conclusion.
Yeah, I can see that. If the connection is solid, it's solid no matter how much extra stuff you throw in. The source also talks about how deduction is connected to formal logic and math.
That's right. Formal logic, like propositional logic, predicate logic, those systems were developed to give us a precise way to model mathematical proofs. The whole idea, going back to the ancient Greeks, like Euclid, was that each step in a proof should necessarily follow from the previous ones. You got to keep that truth flowing all the way to the final theorem.
This whole pursuit of absolute certainty through deduction is super appealing, but the source also mentions some pretty interesting philosophical challenges to this neat picture of deduction.
Oh yeah, there are some really tricky debates. Some point to these logical paradoxes, like the liar paradox, the one that says, this statement is false. That creates some real headaches for the idea of necessary truth preservation. Others argue that there are things called contingent logical truths. Those are statements that are logically true, but they could have been false under different circumstances. And then you've got other views that say maybe deduction isn't about preserving truth itself, but something else, like warrant, which is our justification for believing something, or assertability, whether we're actually entitled to say something, or even coherence, like how well our beliefs fit together as a whole. It gets pretty deep, but it shows that even something as seemingly solid as deduction can have its complexities.
It's like you're peeking behind the curtain of logic itself, and then there's this scandal of deduction, as I call it. If deductive arguments don't add anything new, if the conclusion is already there in the premises, then how can they be informative? How can they teach you anything?
That's the puzzle. If it's already there, even if it's hidden, are we really learning anything new when we deduce it? It's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for a long time.
And even with all these complexities, the source makes sure to highlight Aristotle's contributions to our understanding of deduction.
Yeah, for sure. His work, especially prior analytics, that was foundational for the formal study of deductive reasoning. And his posterior analytics explored how it's used in scientific demonstration. That promise of certainty that deduction offers has made it super influential throughout history. But the source also points out a growing view that maybe deductive reasoning isn't as common in our everyday lives as we might think.
I can relate to that. It does seem like most of our everyday reasoning is a bit more flexible, less about those strict, unbreakable guarantees. Which brings us to the next type of argument, induction. What's the key difference here?
Induction is all about probability, not that absolute certainty we see in deduction. Instead of trying to guarantee a true conclusion from true premises, inductive arguments use observations from the past to draw conclusions about the future or about general principles. The classic example is, the sun rising in the east. We've seen it happen every single day as long as humans have been around. So we induce that it will probably rise in the east tomorrow too. And we might even conclude that the sun always rises in the east. The big takeaway here is that induction moves from specific observations to broader generalizations or predictions. And the conclusions are probable, not certain.
So it's like pattern recognition, right? Noticing patterns and then making generalizations based on them.
Exactly. Inductive arguments rely a lot on statistical frequencies, how often something's happened in the past, and then extending those observations to cases we haven't seen yet. We call an inductive argument cogent when the premises provide strong support for the conclusion, making it highly probable, but still not guaranteed, of course.
That definitely feels more in line with how we learn and make sense of the world. Think about science, for example. It's all about making observations and then drawing general conclusions from that data.
Exactly. Induction is at the heart of the scientific method and a huge part of how we reason in our everyday lives. And a lot of inductive reasoning relies on this unspoken assumption, the uniformity principle. That's the idea that the patterns we've seen in the past will continue to hold in the future.
But then the source brings up Hume's famous problem of induction. That sounds like a major challenge to this whole idea of inductive reasoning.
It is. David Hume was a philosopher who questioned the very foundation of induction. He asked, how can we be sure that the future will resemble the past? He said, we can't deductively prove the uniformity principle because, it's totally possible that everything could change tomorrow. And the kicker is, he said, we can't justify it probabilistically either because any probabilistic argument would have to rely on past observations about how reliable probability is. That creates a circular argument, using induction to justify itself.
So Hume is saying our trust in induction might be more of a habit than a solid, logically justified way of reasoning.
That's a big part of his argument, and it's had a huge impact on philosophy. And the challenges to induction didn't stop there. The philosopher Gilbert Harman, he suggested that what we call induction might actually be a special case of inference to the best explanation. That's the next type of argument we'll be talking about.
And the source mentions some attempts to solve Hume's problem, like Peter Norton's material theory. Sounds like philosophers are still debating this one.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's not just some abstract puzzle. The problem of induction has real-world implications. Like, think about those algorithms that try to predict things about individuals or about social groups based on statistics, predictive policing, for example. Those raise serious questions about how reliable these inductive inferences really are and what the ethical implications are.
Yeah, drawing conclusions about individuals based solely on group statistics can be really dangerous. Okay, so we've looked at deduction and induction. Now let's tackle abduction. The source calls this inference to the best explanation. How does that work?
With abduction, you start with an observation, some fact that needs an explanation. Then you try to figure out the most likely explanation. Unlike induction, which looks for patterns and tries to generalize, abduction is looking backward, trying to find the most likely cause for something that's already happened. The classic example is like a detective at a crime scene, right? They see fingerprints, a broken window, something's missing. And they use abduction to piece together what happened, even though they didn't actually see it.
So it's about finding the best fit for the evidence, even if it's not a perfect fit like in deduction.
Exactly. Abduction doesn't necessarily guarantee truth. The best explanation might turn out to be wrong later on when we get more information. And it's different from induction in what it's focused on. Induction looks for general patterns, probabilities. Abduction is all about finding those explanatory connections, those causal connections that can explain what we observe.
The source mentions that formally recognizing abduction as its own type of inference is kind of a newer thing compared to deduction and induction.
That's right. People have always used this kind of explanatory reasoning. But the idea of abduction as a separate type of inference, that really took off with Charles Sanders Peirce. For Peirce, abduction was all about coming up with new explanations, new hypotheses, the spark of discovery. Deduction and induction were more about working with existing ideas, testing them out. But these days, abduction is often discussed in the context of justification, like arguing that one explanation is better, more likely to be true than the others.
And like induction, it sounds like abduction has its critics and potential problems.
It does. We humans, we love to find explanations, right? But sometimes we jump to conclusions or we oversimplify things. And philosophically, there's the question of whether the best explanation is actually the true explanation. Bas van Fraassen, he's a philosopher who's been critical of relying too heavily on inference to the best explanation. But those who defend abduction point to how successful it's been in science and just in everyday life. They say it's a reliable way to reason, even if we can't perfectly justify it logically.
It's interesting how each of these types of arguments has its own strengths and weaknesses, its own purpose. Now let's move on to analogy. The source says arguments by analogy don't quite fit into the other categories. Why is that?
Arguments by analogy work by finding similarities between two different things, two different situations. The basic idea is, if two things are alike in some ways, they're probably alike in other ways too. The source gives a really interesting example. Imagine an alien species farming humans for food. Is that morally wrong? Well, if it is, then by analogy, it might also be wrong for us to farm animals for food. The argument relies on the perceived similarities between those two situations.
So it's about drawing parallels and then saying what's true in one case should also be true in the other because they're similar.
That's it. And how strong the analogy is, how persuasive it is, that depends on how relevant and how significant those similarities are. How much do they actually relate to the thing you're trying to argue about? The source gives a general format for these arguments. Source S is similar to target T in some known ways. S has a certain feature, therefore T probably has that feature too, or a similar one. The key question is whether the similarities they're pointing to actually justify that leap.
Analogies seem to be pretty common in philosophy, especially when dealing with really complicated or abstract ideas.
Definitely. The source highlights how widespread they've been in philosophical traditions,
Huh.
like the Greeks, the Chinese, the Indians. Plato, for example, he compared rhetoric to pastry baking, saying it's not real nourishment. Philosophy, he said, that's like medicine for the soul. In more recent times, you've got arguments like Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist argument about abortion, or John Searle's Chinese room argument against strong AI. In both cases, they're using an analogy to try and make a complex issue easier to grasp.
And as the source points out, the most common attack on an analogy is to say the things being compared aren't actually similar enough in the ways that matter.
That's right. Critics often say the similarities are superficial or that they don't really relate to the specific point the analogy is trying to make. So analogies can be really powerful, really intuitive, but you always got to scrutinize them carefully, make sure the comparison is solid.
Okay, so we've covered the main types of arguments. Now let's talk about when arguments go wrong. Fallacies. The source finds it interesting that even though these are errors in reasoning, there's been so much study of fallacies. Why is that?
Well, it turns out that being able to spot bad arguments is just as important as knowing how to build good ones. And that's why fallacies, arguments that look good on the surface but have a flaw in their reasoning, have been studied for a long time, going all the way back to Aristotle with his work Sophistical Refutations. The thing is, some fallacies can be really convincing. They play on our biases, we appeal to our emotions, so it's crucial to be able to recognize them.
And the source gives us a few key examples of common fallacies. Equivocation, which plays on the different meanings of a word, begging the question, where you're basically assuming the thing you're trying to prove. Appeal to authority, which relies on someone's status instead of actual reasons. Ad hominem, which attacks the person making the argument instead of the argument itself. And faulty analogy, which we've already touched on. Can you give us an example of how equivocation might work?
Sure, imagine someone saying, all laws should be obeyed. The law of gravity is a law. Therefore, we should obey the law of gravity. See how they're using the word law in two totally different ways. There's laws that people make, and then there's laws of nature. The argument uses that ambiguity to try and get to its conclusion.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And the source also brings up some philosophical questions about fallacies, like what makes an argument a fallacy in the first place? Is it just a structural problem, or does the context matter too? And is focusing on fallacies the best way to study argumentation? The source mentions a philosopher, Gerald Massey, who had some critiques of this. What were his concerns?
Massey and some others, they worried that just labeling something as a fallacy doesn't really tell you why it's bad. It doesn't explain what's wrong with it. They thought a better approach would be to focus on what makes a good argument, develop criteria for that. They also worried that sometimes calling something a fallacy is just a way to shut down discussion instead of actually engaging with the ideas.
But even with those criticisms, the concept of fallacies is still pretty important. It gives us a way to talk about common errors in reasoning, something we can all learn to recognize. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about different types of argumentation as a practice. The source makes a distinction between adversarial and cooperative argumentation. Seems like a pretty fundamental difference. What's the main idea here?
Yeah, it's a big topic in argumentation theory. The question is, what's the main goal of arguing? Is it about winning, like in a debate where you're trying to defeat your opponent? Or is it about working together to understand something better, solve a problem, reach some kind of agreement? The source mentions examples where argumentation is all about being adversarial, trying to overpower your opponent, maybe even using aggressive tactics. You might have seen stuff that presents argument as a battle, something you have to win.
Yeah, that fits with that whole argument is war metaphor we hear all the time.
Exactly. And the source also points to feminist critiques of this adversarial model. They argue that this style of argumentation, it's often associated with aggression, with a masculine way of doing things, and it can make people who aren't comfortable with that style feel excluded. So they often advocate for more cooperative approaches, where the focus is on listening, understanding different perspectives, and finding common ground.
But the source also presents arguments in favor of adversariality. It's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's done in a certain way. What are those defenses?
Some argue that a bit of adversariality can be helpful. The philosopher Trudy Gauvier, she makes a distinction between negative aggression, which is unproductive, and a more minimal kind of adversariality. That can actually make arguments better by exposing weak points in someone's reasoning. The idea is that even when you disagree, you got to have some level of challenge, to test the strength of your claims. And that requires some cooperation on the rules of the game, even within that adversarial context. She talks about ancillary and minimal adversariality, suggesting the latter is essential but doesn't require hostility.
So it's not just one or the other. Maybe different situations call for different mixes of adversariality and cooperation.
Yeah, that's the nuance that the source brings up. You can't just apply one model to every situation. Sometimes a more competitive approach might be what you need. Other times, it's better to be more collaborative.
Makes sense. Now, the source also talks about argumentation as an epistemic practice. What does that mean? What's the focus when we look at it that way?
This view emphasizes the idea that the point of argumentation is to get closer to the truth, to improve our beliefs, expand our knowledge, deepen our understanding. The source traces this back to Plato, who criticized the sophists. He saw them as more interested in just persuading people than in actual knowledge. So from this perspective, the value of an argument is in how well it leads you to more accurate, better supported beliefs.
So it's not just about convincing someone, it's about collaboratively working towards true beliefs based on the strength of the reasons.
Exactly. This view sees argumentation as truth-conducive. It's a process that can lead us to the truth. John Stuart Mill, he was a big proponent of this. In his book on liberty, he argued that having open, vigorous disagreements can be really beneficial for knowledge. He thought that grappling with opposing views, even ones you really disagree with, forces you to examine your own beliefs more carefully. And that can lead to a deeper understanding. Another philosopher, Alvin Goldman, he also talks about the importance of norms that encourage truthful speech and expose falsehoods.
That sounds great in theory. But let's be real, argumentation doesn't always change people's minds, does it?
No, unfortunately not always. There's all sorts of psychological factors at play. Confirmation bias, where we favor information that supports our existing beliefs. Motivated reasoning, where our desires influence how we evaluate evidence. Those can make it hard to be truly open-minded. And then you've got echo chambers and filter bubbles online, which can limit our exposure to different perspectives. And as we said before, fallacious arguments can actually lead people away from the truth, even if they sound convincing.
So while this ideal of truth-seeking through argumentation is appealing, it might not always reflect reality.
That's right. But the force suggests that this epistemological approach can still be a guide for how we should argue, even if we don't always achieve it perfectly. And in some areas, like science, argumentation can be really effective at advancing knowledge.
Okay, let's look at another perspective. Consensus-oriented argumentation. Here, it's not about finding truth, but about reaching agreement. What's the main idea here?
Theories that fall under this view see the main goal of argumentation as reaching a consensus, resolving differences, coordinating with each other. One example is pragma dialectics. The idea is that aligning our beliefs and intentions through discussion is crucial for cooperation and harmony. Think about planning something with a group. You need to talk it out, consider different options, and reach some kind of agreement.
That sounds very connected to deliberative democracy, where decisions are seen as more legitimate if they come from open discussion.
Absolutely. The idea is that decisions made through public deliberation, a reasoned discussion of different viewpoints, are more legitimate than decisions made through simple majority voting. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas, his discourse theory is really influential here. He emphasizes the importance of a public sphere where people can engage in free, equal, and inclusive discussion to reach a rational consensus. His theory of law and democracy is built on this idea of reasoned public discourse.
But the source also mentions some critiques of this consensus-oriented view. It can be really tough to achieve real consensus when there are power imbalances. And sometimes trying too hard to reach consensus can just mask disagreements or make inequalities worse.
That's right. Critics like Chantal Mouffe, for example, they argue that Habermas's ideal of a perfectly rational and egalitarian public sphere is unrealistic. It doesn't account for the power dynamics and the fundamental disagreements that exist in society. The source also notes that argumentation doesn't always lead to consensus. Sometimes it can actually lead to people becoming even more divided. That's called group polarization. And thinkers like Iris Marion Young and Sally Haslanger, They've argued that focusing too much on consensus can silence or marginalize the voices of less powerful groups. They might feel pressured to conform, which can actually reinforce existing power imbalances.
So even though consensus sounds like a good thing, it's more complicated than that.
Definitely. We need to be aware of the potential downsides of focusing too much on consensus.
Okay, last but not least, the source talks about argumentation and conflict management. How does argumentation relate to how we deal with disagreements and conflicts?
The idea here is that argumentation can be a way to manage conflict. Reaching a consensus is one way to do that, but there are others. But the source also recognizes that argumentation itself can be a form of conflict, or it can make existing conflicts worse. It's that argument is war metaphor again.
But then the source quotes Robert Aiken, who says argument is actually a form of pacifism, like using words instead of violence to deal with disagreements.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. The idea is that argumentation offers an alternative to fighting or just avoiding conflict. Even in what are called agonistic views of democracy, like the ones Chantal Mouffe talks about, argumentation is seen as a way to channel conflict into something more productive, even if the goal isn't to eliminate disagreement entirely.
The source does add a word of caution, though. It reminds us that argumentation might not always be enough to solve conflicts, and that power imbalances can really affect how arguments play out.
Exactly. Argumentation can be a useful tool, but it's not a magic solution. You always have to consider the broader context.
This has been a really fascinating look at argumentation. It's clearly a lot more than just stating your opinion and backing it up. It's connected to how we think, how we communicate, how we relate to each other.
It really is. Argumentation, in all its forms and with all its different goals, it's a core part of what it means to act as philosophers in our everyday lives. It's how we engage with ideas, how we try to understand things, how we deal with the complexities of life.
So to recap, understanding the basic structure of arguments, the different types like deduction, induction, abduction, and analogy, and the various goals that argumentation can serve, whether it's truth-seeking, consensus building, or conflict management, all of that gives us a much deeper understanding of how we reason, both with each other and in our own minds.
And while it's important to aim for logical arguments with solid support, we also have to remember that the context, the goals we have, even the emotions involved, those all play a role in how arguments actually work.
This deep dive into arguments and argumentation really shows how important it is to act as philosophers, to engage with ideas in a thoughtful and critical way. It makes you think about how we constantly interact with information, with each other. So, here's a final thought for you. Given all the complexities and potential pitfalls of argumentation, how can you make your own arguments more productive, more insightful, both when you're arguing with others and when you're arguing with yourself? What responsibility do we each have as participants in these discussions that shape our understanding and our relationships? Think about how the different types and functions of argumentation we've talked about might apply to your own experiences, to the information you encounter every day. It's an ongoing process of reflection and engagement, something we can all work on as we navigate the world.
Absolutely. It's about being more aware of the tools we're using when we reason, the goals we're aiming for, and the impact our arguments can have, not just on our own beliefs, but on our relationships and the communities we're a part of.